So today I'm going to be talking about, as we just said, the value of flexibility in baseball roster construction. There's kind of a nice story behind this project. A friend of mine who I did my PhD with at MIT, Tim Chan, who unfortunately can't be here today but is a faculty member at the University of Toronto, he and I met randomly last year at this conference. And without realizing that we both had interest in sports analytics, decided that we wanted to come up with something that we could work on together. And his research interests are around decision-making under uncertainty, and mine are around operational disruptions. And so this idea of injuries as an operational disruption and how do teams best make decisions in the face of that risk was a nice area that kind of joined our research interests. Just as an introduction, this is inspired by a lot of literature around process flexibility in manufacturing networks and supply chains. So what we are taking as an analogy, if you think about production flexibility, the ability for a manufacturing plant to produce multiple products, here in this setting for a baseball roster, we're considering players as factories who are producing innings at individual positions. So those innings at individual positions are the products produced by the player. And this is really motivated by some seminal work by Jordan and Graves, which looks at flexibility in an automotive manufacturing network and how flexibility chaining, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but essentially the ability to chain movements. So if one plant can produce two products and the next plant can produce the next two products, we can sort of chain the movements of products through our manufacturing network, how that creates value for an organization. In our work, we focus on the value that positional flexibility, the ability of a player to play multiple positions, provides for a team, provides a team in the face of injury risks. And we focus on position players, although a similar study could be done of pitchers with a much less complicated flexibility network, right? Starters could play any position, and we just have relievers to starters. We look at this problem in both an average case setting, so what is the expected value that flexibility provides, and also in a worst case setting. So how does this positional flexibility, the depth or flexibility that a team has, help a team mitigate against the worst case outcomes from an injury perspective? It is worth noting that this is just one component of the value of flexibility. Teams can also incorporate positional flexibility in terms of allowing additional tactical decisions by the manager. So if I have a flexible roster, then that would allow the manager to have late inning defensive swaps or to bring in a pinch hitter, a pinch runner. Those types of late game options can be made available through positional flexibility. That is beyond the scope of our study, but it's worth pointing out that we're just looking at this one component, which is how does flexibility help in terms of injury replacements. So to give an example of flexibility chaining, I'm going to talk about a situation that happened on May 2nd of last season. The Tampa Bay Rays were playing the Seattle Mariners when in the top of the sixth inning, B.J. Upton, the starting center fielder, started to experience quad tightness and needed to be removed from the game. So how did the team respond to this? So first, Desmond Jennings, who was rookie outfielder, left fielder, was moved from left field to center field. Desmond Jennings had played center field a bunch in the minors, so was well equipped to handle that position. But now they had to hold it left field. And so Matt Joyce, the starting right fielder, who also has experience at both corners, was moved from right field to left field. Ben Zobrist was moved from second base to right field. Ben Zobrist is kind of a unique player in terms of flexibility and actually one of the motivating players for this study. Ben Zobrist can play infield, second base, and outfield, right field equally well. And when I say equally well, I mean that the value that he contributes to the team for an inning played at each position is the same. So relative to sort of a replacement level, he contributes the same value to each position, which is unusual for infielders and outfielders. After the hole was opened up at second base, Will Rhymes was moved from third base to second base, a position he had played quite a bit historically. Sean Rodriguez, the starting shortstop, was moved to third base. And finally, because I ran out of room on the slide, Elliot Johnson was brought in to replace B.J. Upton, but playing shortstop. So when I talk about flexibility chaining, it's these types of chains that flexibility allows. And in particular, if you have a chain of flexibility, then when you have an injury, it can allow you to bring in your best bench player. right? So if any player on my team gets injured, hopefully I can bring in the best available player from the bench based on this chain of flexibility that is allowed. So just talking about the contributions of our work, in order to assess flexibility, you really need two inputs. You need the risk of injury, and you need the flexibility that players have. So the risk of injury, we model through a statistical model to predict injury risk by age. Fielding skill at multiple positions is really how we think about defensive flexibility. And we need to know not only how well can you play the positions you've played in the past, but how well can you play positions that you've never played before. And so we have novel statistical models for each of these two problems. We think that these models represent interesting and important contributions in their own right. And then taking these inputs, we develop optimization-based models for assigning players to positions in the presence of these injury risks. So we look at the average case assignment through simulation optimization. And that's a technique where you simulate the parameters of an optimization model and then optimize in the presence of those simulated parameters. So we're going to simulate injuries and then optimize with respect to those injuries. And over a large enough number of simulations, that's going to give us a sense of the average case performance. We also look at robust optimization, which is a technique to measure worst case performance. We'll talk more about that later. But the basic idea is that you want to take an adversarial approach. You want to say, what is the most that I can hurt the team by assigning injuries, and let teams then respond. As far as we know, this is the first optimization-based analysis of flexibility for a sports roster construction problem. We think it's an important contribution there as well. The next 4 slides, I'm going to talk about the method. I'll try to go through this at a high level, although there are more technical details in the paper. So if at any point you get lost, go to the website and follow up, or please feel free to ask questions at the end. The data we use, real quickly, we use data from Fangraphs for estimated fielding value historically, UZR 150, and position adjustments. So we need to know in our model what is the offensive contribution that a player makes with respect to the baseline for that position. So these position adjustments adjust for the relative defensive complexity or positional scarcity of each position. These were developed by Tom Tango and used by Fangraphs. We also need offensive projections for players on a team roster. And for that, we use ZIPS projections developed by Dan Zimborski. We could use, for either of these, we could use any system. We just need as inputs defensive values for the players and offensive projections for the season. We also have player information. In particular, our statistical models depend on the player's age, both for injury risk and for defensive skill. We have disabled list history and roster status history to figure out from 1999 through 2011 what percentage of time players spent on the disabled list. So this is how we're going to predict the injury risk. We're going to use this as our input data. And we have the roster status for 2012, which is the rosters that we're going to analyze. So we're looking at rosters at the beginning of the season and analyzing what value flexibility we expect flexibility to have for that season. Right? So this is not a retrospective analysis of flexibility. This is taking rosters at the beginning of the season and using these optimization-based models to see what value we expect flexibility to have. So that's nice because it allows us to do the analysis cleanly, separating out, obviously, the randomness that occurs during the season. And it also then creates a tool that teams could use to evaluate their own rosters. So as I mentioned, the 2 regression models we think are important in this. The first is the fielding regression model. And as I said, that's important because we need to estimate defensive skill at every position. So every player at every position is an important component of the model. We take advantage of a model that allows correlations between positions. We use a linear regression model with correlated random effects. So you can think about a player who plays center field and how well they play center field is closely related to how well they'll play left field, right? Because both skills require getting a good read on the ball as well as being fast to cover a lot of territory. Similarly, a player who plays second base well probably would also, to some extent, play shortstop well, because both positions require quick reaction times, and both positions require soft hands. But we wouldn't expect the relationship between the second base and shortstop skills to be quite as strong as the relationship between left field and center field. So this model that we use estimates those correlations from the data based on players who have played multiple positions. So using that, it creates a population distribution of skill across positions. And the nice thing about this population distribution is having that population distribution implicitly regularizes the data. So in defensive statistics, one of the big challenges is that the data is quite noisy. It often takes multiple years for the data to stabilize. But by incorporating this population distribution, then we have a trade-off between the sample size, the amount of time we've seen a player at a position, and the population distribution. That is, players who haven't played a position often are drawn much more strongly back to this population. So we get this implicit regularization through that correlated population distribution. Our injury regression model is a two-stage model. We first predict the probability of an injury, followed by the duration of that injury. The interesting thing that we found is that the probability of the injury varies significantly by age, but the distribution of the duration does not. So that was kind of a nice finding here. We use the outputs of this as the inputs into our model. So the two outputs in particular are a value that a player creates on a per game basis, and we measure that in runs above replacement. That has three components: an offensive contribution that we get directly from the projections, the defensive contribution we get from our model, and this replacement level adjustment that we get from positional adjustments. And we assume that the replacement level within season is lower than the replacement level out of season. Right? So it is harder to find good talent within a season than it is during the off season. So we adjust that down by additional 10 runs. We also get these injury distributions from our two-stage regression. That's important not just for the mean and variance of the injury rates, but also because now we can use those distributions to sample player injuries from. If we assume that player injuries are independent from these distributions, we can sample directly from that. And this gets us to, these inputs take us into our optimization models. So the first model, the one in the middle, is our no injury assignment. So in that case, we just perform an optimal assignment of player to positions, assuming no injuries. And the reason we do this is we want to figure out what the team composition would be in the case of no flexibility. So we assume that the no flexibility team composition is the same as the no injury assignment of players to position, right? So it's basically going to be the starting lineup of position players. We take that and put that into the top model, which is our simulation optimization model, where we simulate 250 injury realizations, 250 seasons worth of injuries for each of the players. And we optimize for each of those seasons what the assignment of players to positions is. And we do that for the no flexibility case we just described and full flexibility as a comparison. Our robust assignment model, is a little bit harder to conceptualize. But the way to think about it is to think of an adversary choosing the injuries for the team. For example, if the Red Sox front office could choose which injuries the Yankees would realize during the season, right? They could choose the injuries and the durations. Which injuries would they choose? You gave them a budget of injuries, and they had to choose which ones. The challenge there is that they have to think about how the Yankees will optimally respond to those injuries. So this is a technique for this adversarial assignment. And we convert this into a mixed integer linear optimization problem, which is more tractable, and we can solve through with the commercial solver. This gives us two metrics: the value of flexibility, which is the average case difference in that simulation optimization model between the full flexibility and no flexibility case. We measure that as a percentage. And the robust protection level. So again, in this adversarial model, where the Red Sox are determining the Yankees' injuries, we want to say how large is the budget the Red Sox have to degrade the Yankees' performance by a certain percent. Right? So the 10% protection level would be the budget of injuries that the Red Sox have to choose in order to reduce the Yankees' performance by 10%. So now to get into the results, this first slide is actually to highlight an interesting finding of the study, which was that part of the value of flexibility is actually enabling platooning. So the depth on your roster enables a platoon advantage, which in baseball is left-handed batters facing a right-handed pitchers have an advantage. Right? If you face a pitcher of the opposing hand. And so in this table, what you see on the left are the players on the 2012 Dodgers roster. The next column is their position assignments under no flexibility. The blue is their position assignments, the percentage of the season they face a left-handed pitcher, and the red is the percentage of the season, the proportion of the season they face a right-handed pitcher, and the RAR column represents the total value they create over the course of the season. And so what you see when we compare no flexibility with full flexibility is that flexibility allows the Dodgers to introduce platoons at 3 different positions. First base, James Loney and Juan Rivera. Second base, Adam Kennedy and Mark Ellis. And in the outfield, the flexibility chaining actually allows an interesting platoon where Andre Ethier and Tony Gwynn play left field against right and left-handed pitchers. And then Tony Gwynn and Jerry Sands play right field against right and left-handed pitchers. So Tony Gwynn will switch positions based on the handedness of the opposing pitcher. Similarly, for the Cubs, in this case, we're looking at the value of flexibility with simulated injuries. So the Cubs derive significant value from positional flexibility, again, in part through platooning. In this case, they have platoons at second base, left field, and center field. Those platoons persist in the presence of injuries. Additionally, one of the reasons the Cubs have a lot of value from their flexibility is they have a lot of depth. So for instance, one thing we saw was that if there was an injury to Ian Stewart at third base against a right-handed pitcher, the model would introduce Brian LaHare at third base. So the interesting thing about this is that Brian LaHare has never played third base. So our model estimated that Brian LaHare would be 3 runs worse per season than the worst defensive third baseman in the league. He would be a butcher. But because of his offensive contributions, he was close to the expectation of Ian Stewart. So they would only lose about a hundredth of a run per game with this swap. So to compare this across teams, here we have the value of flexibility, again, as a percentage for all teams. The Cubs, who we just discussed, have the highest value of flexibility. The Astros and the White Sox have the lowest value. On the other end of the spectrum, they create about 3.5% in additional value through flexibility. In both cases, the value of flexibility is low due to a lack of bench strength. And in particular for the Astros, it's also a lack of starting lineup strength. But that's why we see them on the low end of the spectrum. So when someone gets injured, they only have replacement level players to bring in. Looking at the robust protection levels that I described before, what is the budget that we have to give the Red Sox front office in order to damage the Yankees? Here we're saying the 10% performance degradation level. So in this case, we see that the A's are the most protected against injuries. It takes a budget of 5 standard deviations of the player injury distribution in order to reduce their performance by 10%. The Rays and the Nationals are the least protected. And it was kind of interesting in this case that they're the least protected for the same reason. They each have a superstar third baseman who, when injured, gets replaced by replacement level players. So in the case of the Rays, it's Evan Longoria. In the case of the Nationals, it's Ryan Zimmerman. In both cases, if they were injured for the 2012 season, it would be largely replacement level players coming in. Interesting anecdote there is the Rays won 90 games, missed the playoffs by 3 games, with Evan Longoria injured for half the season. The Nationals won 98 games, made the playoffs with Ryan Zimmerman healthy throughout. So we think that this represents an underappreciated area, not just because of that anecdote, but we think that this represents an underappreciated area for improving team rosters. And just to conclude, again, to highlight some of our findings, we find that the risk of injury depends significantly on age, but it doesn't seem like the duration of injuries does. At least statistically, it's not a significant factor. In both this average case value flexibility and worst case protection against injuries, there's significant variation across teams. Again, highlighting this fact that we think it's an underappreciated area for improving team rosters. Flexibility and team balance in the robust setting are both important. So this presence of a superstar creates some risk for a team. So if you can balance your lineup, that provides additional protection. And we think that this is not only a tool for analysis, but a tool that teams can use to evaluate their rosters. So with that, thank you. I'll turn it over to questions. If anybody has any questions, please come to the center for the microphone.
what's the way teams should use their resources to address this? Is this paying for players who are good on the bench, or is there underdevelopment in the minor leagues of players with positional flexibility? I mean, it seems like as kids are growing up, best players, best hitters, they're playing shortstop, they can do a lot of things, but there's probably a lot of specialization in their development in college and the minors. What does this tell you about where the resources should be expended?
So I think that teams have tended to value flexibility throughout their bench, whereas one of the things that we kind of found is if you had a next best player on your bench who was likely to come in, right? Over the course of the season, your starting lineup is going to lose about a full season worth of time for injuries. So if you have a good player on your bench who through flexibility you can get into your lineup regardless of who gets injured, that's a pretty powerful position to be in. So that's one way I think teams can think about it. The other way I think teams can think about it, and is something that we're trying to incorporate in the model, is what are the right ways to build a little bit of flexibility through spring training position experiments, right? So if we can put, our left fielder has always played left field, but if we can get him a few innings, we know that the model says he might be the next person if our third baseman gets injured. If we could get him a few innings there to try to validate what the model says, especially on the defensive side, then I think that would be a useful outcome as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I had a question about the graph, the first graph about the flexibility.
This one?
Yeah. I was wondering why you thought the Rays were so far on the right, despite the example, and the fact that Joe Madden is known for getting creative with his lineup and shifts and whatnot.
So as I said, part of the motivation for this study was Ben Zobrist. And in particular, my expectation was that the Rays were going to show up as a high-performing team along this metric. And what I found with last year's roster, right? This is just evaluating one roster, so this is not a permanent state. But what I found with last year's roster is that there was a lot of flexibility on the bench, but it was flexibility on the bench of players who were expected to be at a replacement level, right? So you had a lot of flexibility of bringing in bad players. And so what ends up happening in the case of the Rays, and I think that this makes sense with the budget constraints, is they have put a lot of effort into getting the best players in the starting lineup, but when anybody gets injured, they don't have a good player necessarily to come in. So they have a lot of players who can come in, and they have a lot of different players who can play those positions. They can move everybody around. But the players who are actually coming in the lineup just weren't that good.
Great. Thanks again. That's all we have time for today.
Okay. I'll be here, so if you have more questions. Thank you.